Without notice. I give the call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. ANZ and Westpac are both forecasting per capita recessions, while inflation remains higher for longer. Australians are working harder for less under this government. When will the Prime Minister take responsibility for making things worse for Middle Australia?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Shadow Treasurer for his question, and the Treasurer, though, is very disappointed. He expected you're on question one. He thought this was the moment. This was the moment, and it still didn't happen. The Shadow Treasurer is up there, having been part of a government that presided over the highest quarterly inflation increase this century of 2.1%. Also decided, while that was happening, to bring down a budget that splashed money everywhere and projected, of course, a $78 billion surplus. Unlike what this government has done, which is to produce a budget under this Treasurer that projects a $4.2 billion increase.
Member for Deakin.
Now, the Shadow Treasurer is once again talking down the Australian economy, talking it down. Well, I'm very proud of our economic record. 465,000 reasons to be proud, Mr. Speaker.
The Treasurer will cease interjecting or be warned.
Most jobs created in the first year of any government in Australian history. The most jobs created by any new government in Australian history. We are the party of jobs, jobs and jobs, and that is confirmed. We also have wages growing after the period in which they were opposite saying that real wage depression was
the member for Hume has
key
asked his
feature
question.
of their economic architecture. We also have the highest number of women in full-time work in Australian history. Mr. Speaker, they over there have the hide to having presided over the first recession in 3 decades. They come in here and talk down the Australian economy. Well, we on this side will continue to promote our positive plans for economic growth, our positive plans for employment, our positive plans for an economy that works for people, not the other way around, at the same time as we're making substantial investments in social policy and making a difference, such as our announcement on Saturday of $2 billion additional funding for public housing to make a difference to the economy so that jobs will be created, so that people have a place to live. A sort of commitment that would never be made by any coalition government.
Order. I'll hear from the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Constitutional recognition through a voice to Parliament started with Indigenous Australians. How is the government delivering on the aspirations of First Nations people as expressed in the Uluru Statement of the Heart?
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
I thank the member for Lingiari for her question. She understands, as many do, that today is a big day, as big as Uluru, because the day the Senate has passed the Constitution Alteration Bill without amendment. This is the final hurdle to holding a referendum later this year on constitutional recognition through the voice. The race to recognition is on. We are one step closer to finally recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our nation's founding document. One step closer to giving a voice to Indigenous Australians. Today, the political debate ends and we can start a national conversation at the community level about what the voice is, why it is needed and how it will make a practical difference. I want to acknowledge today a famous Essendon legend in the gallery, Michael Long, who joins us here. And thank you for your advocacy, Michael, ahead of the referendum. And as you say, the Voice will have a ripple effect of change for the better. I also acknowledge representatives of from Jarwin in the gallery. And to those Australians who want to know more, I say this. The Voice is a huge opportunity to take Australia forward. It is our chance to do something practical that can help us close the gap. Last week we saw new data, 4 of the 19 targets on track, just 4. Life expectancy not on track. Indigenous babies born at a healthy birth weight not on track. Indigenous people finishing Year 12 not on track. If we needed any more evidence that more of the same isn't good enough, this is it. We have to do things better, and that's where the Voice of Parliament can help. A resource of local knowledge. It will be chosen by Aboriginal people. It will be about health, education and housing, things that directly affect Aboriginal people. But instead of listening, we've spent years and probably billions of dollars on poor outcomes. This is a chance to change that. This is about listening and recognition. Let's fulfil the promise of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Let's make 2023 the year of the Voice. Let's vote yes to recognition, unify this country, grow it up and make us all proud to be Australians.
The call to the honourable member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Fancy Leaf is a lettuce farm in Morayfield in my electorate of Longman. Their power bills have more than doubled since the same time last year. The price of the stock they buy has increased dramatically, and they are now paying a fuel surcharge to receive that stock. These costs will have to be passed on to consumers who are already struggling. When will the Prime Minister take responsibility for making things worse for Middle Australia?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Longman for his question. Well, what we have done is to put in place measures that the member for Longman voted against. He voted against $3 billion.
Order.
$3 billion of energy price relief. And
Members
the member
on my
would
left.
be aware as well that I got this question from another Queenslander last week, that the Queensland budget that was handed down just a week ago as well, in partnership with the work that we have done, will make an enormous difference. It will mean, literally, that for many pensioners and low-income Queenslanders, their energy bills will be zero.
The member for
going
Fairfax
forward.
is interjecting.
Zero, as a result of action that has been taken. And that stands in stark contrast to the 22 policies announced by those opposite where they didn't land one. The fact that they took 4 gigawatts out of the system but only put 1 gigawatt in. That they left Australia with the national energy grid that was built for the last century. They promised in 2019, including this former minister across here, to reduce wholesale electricity price to less than $70 per megawatt hour by the end of 2021. That's what he promised. He promised $70. Instead, it was $286. He promised to spend $1 billion to pump an additional 3,800 megawatts of electricity into the grid, but instead he spent, guess how much? Zero. Not a single watt, let alone a kilowatt into the system. These are the mob that masterminded a national oil reserve 14,000 kilometres away in Texas.
Order.
That's what
The
they
Prime
did.
Minister will pause. The member for Hume, if he continues to interject, will be warned. The Prime Minister has completed his answer. Order. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister. The member for Fairfax and the Prime Minister will cease interjecting. I want to hear from the member for McNamara in silence. He has the call.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Why is the proposed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice such an important addition to our Constitution?
Give the call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for McNamara for his question. Today is an historic day. A bill to amend the Constitution has passed the Australian Parliament, and this means that later this year the Australian people will have their say on whether to recognise the First Peoples of Australia through an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice enshrined in our Constitution. The referendum will be about two things. First, it's about recognising that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have occupied the Australian continent for more than 60,000 years and represent the oldest continuing living cultures in human history. They've maintained a relationship with Australia's lands, waters and skies since time immemorial. The Australian Constitution has never recognised the unique status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this country. The time has come to do precisely that. Second, this referendum is about listening to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples about the laws and policies that affect them. We know that we must do better to address the unacceptable gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. We must do better to reduce the shockingly high incarceration rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, the poor health outcomes and the lower life expectancy. We know that better policies are made when they are shaped by those most affected. We know because we've seen the evidence. The words of the proposed amendment to the Constitution are simple and they are powerful. The words of the proposed amendment are the product of a comprehensive process of consultation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and the best legal minds in the country, including the Solicitor-General. I thank the Referendum Working Group, the Referendum Engagement Group and the Constitutional Experts Group, and I applaud my colleagues, the Minister for Indigenous Australians and Senator Patrick Dodson, for their extraordinary work. The Solicitor-General has stated very clearly that the voice is, quote, not just compatible with the system of representative and responsible government prescribed by the Constitution, but an enhancement of the system. So, the short answer to the member's question is that the proposed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice is an important addition to the Constitution because it will make our Constitution better. This referendum can be a unifying moment for our country, and I believe it will be a unifying moment. It's a unique opportunity to address the injustices of the past and create change that will deliver a better future.
Give the call to the honourable member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Shocking allegations in 2019 led to the Set the Standard report and the development of the first ever Code of Conduct for parliamentarians. In February, you led the Chamber's endorsement of the behaviour standards and codes for all Commonwealth workplaces. But the behaviours of the past week show we have a long way to go to change the culture of this place. Will the Prime Minister commit to expediting the due date for the full implementation and enforcement of the behaviour standards and code?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for North Sydney for her question and for her constructive contribution on this and other issues in this chamber as a new member. The government is committed to implementing all 28 recommendations from Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins' review into Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. Parliament House will never be a typical workplace, but it must be a safe workplace, a respectful workplace, a workplace that lives up to the ideals that our democracy is built on: equality, fairness, decency and respect for all. It must also be a workplace worthy of the nation and the people we are called here to serve. Earlier this year, the Parliament endorsed new draft codes of conduct. This was a historic moment, and we're working across the Parliament to establish the enforcement of the codes as a priority. All parliamentarians and staff should already be complying with those codes of conduct and the new behaviour standards for everyone who works in Parliament. Behaviour that would not be accepted in workplaces across the country should certainly not be accepted here in this Parliament. To help drive cultural change, we expect to have a keystone reform of the Jenkins report, an independent statutory HR agency up and running from October this year, with cooperation from across the Parliament. We're also working to establish the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission and to implement recommendations to the review of the Members of Parliament Staff Act as quickly as possible. And I say to the member, with regard to timing, we will do it as soon as we can. But we want to make sure as well that we get it right, and we also want to make sure that we have the full input of people across the Parliament and ownership of people across the Parliament. These reforms do require that cooperation, and we continue to work through the Parliamentary Leadership Task Force to secure this cooperation. We're also prioritising close consultation with staff as we implement these reforms. We know that staff can be vulnerable in these workplaces, and it's critical that we make sure that these reforms work in the interests of our staff. The government is committed to progressing these essential reforms and to getting them right, and I look forward to working with the member for North Sydney and other members and senators to make sure we do just that.
Give a call to the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The Constitution Alteration Bill has now passed the Parliament. What message does this significant and positive achievement send to Australians?
Give a call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question and for his advocacy of reconciliation and of a constitutional change to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our nation's founding document. Today our Parliament has said yes to holding a referendum. Now the Australian people will have a chance to say yes in a referendum that will be held in the last quarter of this year. What began at Uluru all those years ago returns to the people. It's over to you. And I say to my fellow Australians that parliaments pass laws, but it is people who make history. This is your time, your chance, your opportunity. It will be a moment of national unity, a chance to make our nation even greater, a gracious chapter in the story of Australia. This change isn't about detracting from the 122 years of our democracy. It's about, as the Solicitor General said, enhancing that democracy. The fact is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are amongst our most disadvantaged. We can't continue to do the same things and expect a different outcome. For 122 years, with the best of intentions, governments have done things for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is about doing things with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, listening to what their concerns are. And I know that Australians are compassionate, and they know we can do more than one thing at a time. Australians are generous enough to care about the most vulnerable amongst us, but they're also generous enough to know that helping someone else doesn't make their life harder. Every act of goodwill we've made as a people has been an investment in our nation, and the returns have been extraordinary. We have nothing to lose by voting yes. So much for Australia to gain. And just as before the apology to the stolen generations that we gave in this Parliament 15 years ago, that was opposed at the time, we were told it could lead to bad outcomes. It's celebrated today, and this will be celebrated as well. All of the changes that have been made, the Mabo decision, the pouring of sand through Vincent Lingari's hands that's so famous, the 1967 referendum, all of them were milestones of national progress, and this can be again. A yes vote at this referendum is a chance for all of us to take the next step on the journey of reconciliation, to take it together, because that's when we're at our best, to be part of a better and more reconciled future.
Give the call to the honourable member for Riverina.
The question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, your own local pharmacist, Adele Tahan, who vaccinated you against COVID-19 and who you mentioned in the parliament just a few short weeks ago, has described the dispensing changes as hitting the pharmacy sector, quote, like a wrecking ball. Prime Minister, is she right?
Order. The member for Boothby. The member for Barker reminded members the time is not to interject before the Prime Minister speaks. He has the call.
Yeah, I thank the member for Riverina for his question. Adele Tahan is a very good pharmacist in my electorate. Her pharmacy is at Roselle, and I regularly either get the flu vaccination or other work either there in Roselle or at my local pharmacy in Marrickville. And we have a campaign by the Pharmacy Guild, of which Adele is the Vice President of the Pharmacy Guild. And like any union, they're entitled to advocate for their members.
Members on my left, members on my right. Order. The House will come to order.
But like any other union, sometimes they don't get it right. Because they're advocating for their members, and we are in constructive discussions with them. I want to see pharmacies thrive. But I tell you who else I care about, besides the person who's the pharmacist, I care about the person who goes into the pharmacy. I care about the 6 million Australians who will benefit from cheaper medicines. That's what I care about. Because
Minister for Infrastructure.
the logic that says that someone who has a permanent condition, who will need a particular drug for the rest of their lives, be it for diabetes or a heart condition or other conditions, who can get a script for 60 days rather than 30 days, should pay twice as much, should go twice as often to the doctor, is quite frankly absurd. And the reason why it was recommended to the former government, in which the member served as the Deputy Prime Minister for a little while before that terrible movie that had a sequel, Barnaby Joyce 2.
Order. The Prime Minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
Is that you have no credibility ever arguing at this dispatch box on microeconomic reform or about efficiencies or about productivity if you argue that that's a good model. And that's why it was put forward to us. So we'll work. We'll work through.
The member for Fairfax
you received this advice years ago, at least 5 years ago, and didn't take it. We make no apologies for standing for cheaper medicines.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. I remind the member for the member for Forest will cease interjecting. I remind all members to use correct titles of members at all times. Give the call to the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Why is it important for the government to protect the health of vulnerable Australians against the risk of COVID-19 infection? Is the Minister aware of any instances of people receiving preferential access to vaccines which may have posed a risk to public health?
Order. Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Macarthur for his question, for his advice. to this side but to the whole parliament over the last 3 or 4 years as the nation grappled with this pandemic. Because right through this dreadful pandemic, both Australian governments, frankly, have been particularly focused on protecting those Australians who were most at risk of severe death or severe disease or death. And my predecessors, Greg Hunt and his colleague Ken Wyatt, worked particularly hard at protecting First Nations communities during this pandemic, working hand in hand with those communities and organisations like NACCHO, and I pay credit to Greg and to Ken for that work. It must be said I was more critical about the former government's slowness in securing vaccine deals in the first year or two, which meant that Australia was desperately short of Pfizer doses in the middle part of 2021, just as the Delta wave was building. Indeed, in July of that year, the ATAGI advice was that Pfizer not be administered to people over the age of 50. And, Mr Speaker, this background highlights why there is so much concern at reports over the weekend that the member for Leichhardt arranged for a local property developer aged in his 60s to travel to Thursday Island to receive a Pfizer dose in that very month of July. Concerned that it was clearly understood across the nation that this man was not eligible on ATAGI advice for the Pfizer vaccine. Concerned that he was taking a dose that was intended to protect the vulnerable members of that community on Thursday Island, and concerned that unnecessary travel to First Nations communities exposed those communities to a risk of infection, a risk that had been clearly identified and articulated by Greg Hunt and Ken Wyatt to their credit. Now, the member for Leichhardt's own colleagues have reported on a large donation of $304,000 from this property developer, $4,000 of which, Mr Speaker, was apparently for just one dinner attended by just 5 people. Some dinner it must have been, Mr Speaker. And the member for Leichhardt's constituents will draw their own conclusions about those elements of this story. But the member does have very serious questions to answer, Mr Speaker, about his actions at a time when his own government was so focused on protecting the health of vulnerable First Nations communities, including Thursday Island, and when other Australians were expected to queue patiently for short-dose vaccines and not to charter a private plane to fly to a Thursday Island community to access one of theirs. I note, Mr Speaker, that an hour or two before question time, the Queensland Government has announced that this matter has been referred to the Queensland Crime and Corruption Commission in that state for inquiry.
The minister's time has concluded. I give the call to the member for Leichhardt.
To respond to that nonsense.
That is, the member for Leichhardt has many opportunities in the House to make statements. This is not one of them. Give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, why are Australians being asked to make the biggest change to Australia's constitution in decades, creating a permanent new body without any details how it would operate? Why is the Prime Minister refusing to provide these details to the Australian people before the referendum?
The Leader will resume his seat. There is far too much noise on my right. Same rules apply to both sides of the House. The Leader of the Opposition will be heard in silence and he'll do his question again.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, why are Australians being asked to make the biggest change to Australia's constitution in decades, creating a permanent new body without any details as to how it would operate? Why is the Prime Minister refusing to provide these details to the Australian public before the referendum?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The referendum is very clear. It's about 2 things.
Order.
It's about recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our constitution, and it's about listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on matters that affect them. The question being put forward is very clear. A proposed law to alter the constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve of this proposed alteration? The then words to be put forward are very clear as well. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And importantly, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Mr Speaker,
the member for Fairfax. The member for Moncrieff. Order. There's far too much noise on my left. The Leader of the Opposition was heard in silence for his question. The Prime Minister deserves the same respect, and I'll, in continuation.
Speaker, I make this point, that I am hopeful that we can have a respectful debate going forward. A respectful debate going forward.
Order.
Clause 3 there makes it very clear that there is no right of veto, that this Parliament will be prime. The principles that have been put forward as well are: 1. The Voice will give independent advice to the Parliament and Government. 2. The Voice will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of local communities, not appointed by the government. 3. It will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities with a gender balance and include youth. 4. It will be empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful and culturally informed. 5. It will be accountable and transparent. 6. The Voice will work alongside existing organisations and traditional structures. 7. The Voice will not have a program delivery function. And 8. The Voice will not have a veto power. Mr Speaker, the fact that the legislation, if the referendum is successful, will come before this Parliament. This Parliament will determine the structure, the composition, the powers and the procedures going forward. And I think, Mr Speaker, I hope that there can be a respectful debate on this issue, and I hope that people avoid misinformation. This needs to be above politics as usual, Mr Speaker. It needs to be above politics as usual.
The member for O'Connor. The House will come to order. Give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. How is the Albanese Labor government working to make sure more Australians have a safe and affordable place to call home? And what is standing in the way of further progress?
Order. Order. Give the call to the Minister for Housing, Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I do want to thank the member for Moreton for his question. And I know that he, like all of us on this side of the House and the Tills over here, actually want more Australians to be in a safe, affordable place to call home. And indeed, what we announced on the weekend was a further addition to our ambitious housing agenda, Mr Speaker, where we announced a $2 billion social housing accelerator plan. And I'm pleased to tell the member for Moreton that that means $398 million for his home state of Queensland in additional funding. I'm also pleased to tell the member for Moreton that we want to deliver that money within the next 2 weeks, and we want it expended or contracted by the governments within 2 years, Mr Speaker, because we know how critical it is that we get more homes on the ground as quickly as we can. And of course, this is a broad part of our housing agenda. So just this financial year, our government is investing $9.5 billion in this year for social and affordable housing and homelessness services. $9.5 billion. We are taking the housing challenges seriously, Mr Speaker. Unfortunately, Mr Speaker, I can't say the same for some of the other people in this place. Unfortunately, and actually really distressingly today, what we saw in the Senate was quite dismaying for those Australians who are trying to get a safe, affordable place to call home. What we saw was the Liberal Party and the Greens team up to essentially delay and block funding for social and affordable housing. That's what we saw. And this is really tragic for those Australians who are languishing on waiting lists, for those Australians who do want to find somewhere to call home. this is really deeply distressing for all of those Australians who have been relying on this funding to get more homes on the ground, and for those Australians who need somewhere to live today. Can I tell the House,
Member for
when you
Lyons.
talk about delays to this fund, what we're talking about is for every 6-month delay, $250 million. We're talking about every day delayed past 1 July is $1.3 million a day that we are not spending on social and affordable housing for Australians that need it today, because those two teamed up against very important legislation, Mr Speaker. And I say to those Australians who are doing it tough out there, we do have a broad housing agenda and we are getting on with the job. And you did see that on the weekend with our significant announcement, and of course when we announced our $575 million last year with our housing accord, with our changes in the last budget. This government is being very serious about getting more homes on the ground and getting more Australians into a safe, affordable homes. It's a shame we can't say that about some of the people in this place.
Give the call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Minister, what areas of public policy will not be within the scope of The Voice?
Order. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. The House will come to order. The Minister for Indigenous Australians has the call.
Can I thank the member opposite for her question and say that if she listened more carefully to the debate, she wouldn't have to answer that question. In relation to the role of The Voice, we have been extraordinarily clear, and we have listened to the aspirations of First Nations Australians through an engagement group, through a working group, through many discussions on the ground in local communities, as well as the expert legal group. I have spoken at length with my colleagues and spoken at length with many people in this House. The answer to the question is that it is stated time and time again that The Voice will concern itself with issues that directly affect First Nations people. And what I find absolutely appalling by that question, what I find absolutely appalling
the Leader of the Opposition will
is
cease
that
interjecting.
you are throwing red herrings. At 3:45, there was a question in the Senate on Saturday morning, something about how will The Voice affect the Link Road in Melbourne, and that came from Senator Cash. I don't think The Voice will have time to worry about the Link Road in Melbourne.
Give the call. Order. Members on my left. Order. There'll be silence so I can hear from the member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer.
The member for Wannon. I just said there'd be silence and you start the conversation. When I say silence, that means no talking.
Clowns on the front bench.
I give the call to the member for Aston and start the clock again so I can hear her question.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How are the Albanese Labor government's housing policies helping lay the foundations for a stronger economy after a wasted decade, and what is standing in the way?
The call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the wonderful member for Aston. 3 times as many questions as the member for Hume since the budget reply last month. Mr Speaker, the wasted decade in this country made our country more vulnerable to global economic uncertainty. That's true in the housing market, it's true as well in the labour market. But the Albanese government has recorded, as the PM said, the strongest jobs growth in its first year of any new government on record, more than 465,000 jobs. And we see new analysis released today that shows that Australia is a world leader when it comes to job creation and workforce participation, well ahead of all the major advanced economies, the highest participation rate and the strongest jobs growth since May 2022. But we know that what we need to do, Mr Speaker, is to make sure that there are affordable homes close to where the jobs and opportunities are being created in our country. And that's why building more homes has been absolutely central to our first two budgets and to our broader economic plan. And I wanted to pay tribute, Mr Speaker, to this Housing Minister and this Prime Minister for the announcement that they made on the weekend, a $2 billion social housing accelerator, which will build thousands of new homes in our country. It will mean more housing for more people in more parts of our nation, and it's part of our broad and ambitious housing agenda. The National Housing Accord, the biggest increase to Commonwealth rent assistance in 30 years, expanding the first house guarantee and regional first home buyer guarantee, increasing the liability cap of the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, and also extra funding to the states and territories through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement to help tackle homelessness, Mr Speaker. Now, earlier on today, the Senate had an opportunity to advance this substantial and broad and ambitious housing agenda, and the Senate failed to grasp that opportunity. The Housing Australia Future Fund is a really important part of building more homes for more people, particularly the most vulnerable in our country, including women and kids fleeing domestic violence. And it beggars belief, Mr Speaker, that the Greens have teamed up with the Coalition to stop those tens of thousands of homes being built. Now, it was a big test for the Greens, Mr Speaker, and the Coalition in the Senate, and they failed that test. Now, the Greens in particular, they give these speeches about saying they support social housing, but when the crunch comes, and when it comes time to put their hand up for more social housing, they put political posturing and product differentiation before the right outcomes for the most vulnerable people in our society. So after the vote in the Senate today, Mr Speaker, one thing is abundantly clear. The Labor Party is trying to build more homes, more social and affordable homes. The Greens are voting with the Coalition to prevent them being built.
Give the call to the member for Fowler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. I understand the government is optimistic Australia will not fall into a recession. In Fowler, charities are seeing unprecedented number of middle-income families needing help. Small businesses are struggling to keep up with increased costs and are not seeing the same level of customers. More people are now working at a second job to meet the cost of living pressure. We're yet to feel the impact of the 12 interest rates hikes. How confident should the Australian public be that we're not heading into a recession if we're not already in one?
The call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for Fowler for her question and her representation. It is not currently the expectation of the Treasury or the Reserve Bank or a number of other credible institutions and forecasters that Australia will go down that path. But what we've tried to do on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, is to be upfront about the challenges that we do confront in our economy. And we said in the budget, before that and after that, that we do expect the Australian economy to slow considerably. This is the inevitable consequence of the interest rate rises which began before the election and continued after, and also the substantial slowdown in the global economy. And so I say to your constituents and I say to communities right around Australia that what we are trying to do and what we are doing in our first two budgets is to try and provide help where we can to get your constituents and communities around Australia through a difficult and challenging period in the global and domestic economies, provide some help where we can, and also lay the foundations for future growth at the same time. Now, one of the ways that we do that is to make sure that we get the budget in much better nick so that we can afford to help people and so that we can invest, whether it's in energy or technology or skills and capacities of our people, to invest meaningfully in the future so that we can weather the storm which is coming at us from around the world at the same time as we lay the foundations for a better future and a stronger economy as well. Now, one of the reasons that we're able to do that, Mr Speaker, which would be completely unrecognisable to those opposite, is we've worked out over two budgets how do we try and get genuine value for money from these investments. And that means winding back on the waste and rorts which defined their economic mismanagement on that side of the House for too long. One of the big reasons why we had this wasted decade in our economy, and one of the reasons why we inherited $1 trillion of debt with nowhere near enough to show for it. It's why we inherited deficits as far as the eye can see, and it's why even after a decade of those in office from those opposite, there were so many economic challenges for us to address. We accept responsibility for addressing the challenges in the economy. We're upfront about what's coming at us from around the world but being felt around the kitchen tables of Fowler and in communities right around the country. And we are prepared to work with anyone in this place who shares our objectives, which is to get people through a difficult patch at the same time as we invest in the future.
Give the call to the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to address the need for more affordable and social housing, and what is getting in the way?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Newcastle for her question, and as she knows, the Labor government that I lead believes that every Australian deserves the security, stability and dignity of a roof over their head. It's important. It's important. I know it because I've lived it. And on Saturday I was proud to announce our new $2 billion social housing accelerator, funding to be delivered to states and territories within 2 weeks, funding that we're able to do because we had a responsible budget going forward that has created this space. It builds on what we've been doing so far. A National Housing Accord, increased funding for social and affordable rental housing, $2 billion in financing for social and affordable rental homes through the NIFIC, largest rent assistance increase in 30 years. And of course our Housing Australia Future Fund, which failed to pass today because of an unholy alliance between the Coalition and the Greens. The new coalition, Mr Speaker, the new coalition. Now, we expect the Liberals to oppose public housing because they've never ever supported it. But what we had over there, with the Greens teaming up with them, is working to block public housing. Well, let me say this. This isn't student politics. What happens here affects the country. And instead of hyperventilating like a debating team, you need to bring people together to get things done. Those in that corner, Mr Speaker, they deal in protests, we deal in progress. They see issues to campaign on, we see challenges to act on. They want to build their profile, we want to build more homes. Building a brand doesn't put a roof over anyone's head, Mr Speaker. Families can't take shelter under a petition.
Order.
When you want work done, call for the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, because we don't stop working on things because the Greens have cold feet. We're not waiting around for them, promising the world, delivering nothing. This is what it means to lead to govern. We keep working till we find a solution, bringing people together on a plan that works. That's what we've done. That's what we'll continue to do, because we know that this issue is too important to wait.
Give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians, and I refer to her previous answer. When asked what matters would not be within the remit of The Voice, she said, quotes, "The Voice will concern itself with issues that directly affect First Nations people," close quotes. Minister, which policies do not directly affect First Nations people?
Order. The Minister for the Environment. Members on my left. Order. The member for Moncrieff. We heard the manager read his question in silence. The minister will be given the same courtesy, and she has the call.
Read it. It's not
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for the question. We should all reflect that just on Monday, the Productivity Commission brought down a report on the Closing the Gap targets. And they told a terrible story. We are elected into this place to represent everybody. And to do that is also to understand these statistics. The life expectancy gap is not on track. It is not okay that my life expectancy is 8 years shorter than the deputy. It's not okay. It is not okay that for those of you that have children who are doing Year 12, that those outcomes will not be as good for First Nations students. It is not okay that babies are born at unhealthy birth weights. That is not okay. The fact that I visited a community last week where there were 30 people living in a 2-bedroom unit is not acceptable. This is why the voice is important. This is why it will make a practical difference on the ground. This will make a very practical difference.
Order. The Minister. Order. The Minister for the Environment. The Minister for the Environment is warned and will not interject. The Manager of Opposition Business, I'm trying to hear his point of order.
Respectful debate. Thanks, Pam. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on relevance, I think all fair-minded Australians agree with the point about the work we collectively have to do on the Closing the Gap targets. The question goes to the voice. Minister, which policies do not directly affect First Nations people?
The member for Gellibrand is warned. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
On 2 points of order, Mr. Speaker. One, on the relevance rule, what matters is whether or not it's relevant to the terms of the question. That's what standing orders say, and I'd put that it is. Secondly, and I didn't want to interrupt while the minister was speaking, but I get that when a minister, and some of us do it, I'm guilty of it, deliberately inflame the place, people will interject back. The constant interjections, in particular from the member for New England.
Order. Order.
Interjections are always disorderly. But it is also the case.
What you're doing now.
It's what you're doing now.
Order.
I know you get angry a lot, but it's what you're doing now. Mr. Speaker, when an answer is being given in the tone in which the Minister for Indigenous Affairs is giving the answer, the interjections that are coming from those opposite simply should not be there.
I'm listening to the minister. Order. I'm listening to the minister carefully to make sure she's being relevant regarding the question. Interjections are highly disorderly. I want to hear what the minister has to say, and I'm sure all members want to hear what she has to say. I issue a general warning for the House and ask the minister in continuation to be relevant to the question. I'll listen to her answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the incredibly important design principles of the Voice to Parliament is that it will work alongside and with existing organisations and traditional structures. The coalition of the peaks is fundamental to the Closing the Gap targets, and the Voice will be able to work alongside the coalition of peaks in terms of the implementation plan. Let us remember that when the opposition came into government last time, they cut $500 million out of the Indigenous Affairs budget, and that had a devastating effect. This country does not want to see further disadvantage, and the Voice is about practical outcomes, it's about recognition, and those two things is what you need to understand.
Order. Give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How is the social services portfolio contributing to help more Australians secure a home, and what is standing in the way?
The call to the Minister for Social Services.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Canberra for her question. Of course, the Albanese government is turning the tide of 10 years of inaction by those sitting opposite and have begun to delivering our comprehensive housing agenda for Australians. We understand that people are doing it tough, particularly those renting, and that's why in last month's budget the government invested an extra $2.7 billion to increase Commonwealth renter assistance maximum rates by 15%. This is the largest increase to rent assistance in more than 30 years, and more than 1 million households will benefit, including pensioners, families, veterans, job seekers and students. Of course, also in my portfolio, we are building more emergency accommodation for women and children experiencing family and domestic violence. Since forming government, I have taken steps to ensure the successful delivery of a number of Safe Places projects, delivering much-needed crisis accommodation on the ground for women and children escaping family and domestic violence. And we will invest a further $100 million for the Safe Places program to deliver up to more than 720 more places nationally for women. Of course, on the weekend, the Prime Minister, along with the Minister for Housing, announced a $2 billion social housing accelerator. And of course, through our Housing Australia Future Fund, we have a plan to deliver more than 30,000 new social and affordable homes for Australians who need a safe and affordable place to call home, including 4,000 of those homes for women and children impacted by family and domestic violence, and of course older women who are experiencing homelessness. Now, of course, this is a very comprehensive plan, and it was disappointing to see the coalition team up with the Greens to block the delivery of homes on the ground. It seems that the Liberals, Nationals and the Greens would rather play political games than vote to deliver more sociable and affordable housing to Australians that need it. Because voting to delay the Housing Australia Future Fund is standing in the way of delivering more housing stock for Australians that want safe and affordable place to call home. I need to reinforce it is only Labor that has a plan to boost Commonwealth rent assistance, to deliver emergency accommodation for women and children escaping domestic violence, and to build more social and affordable housing. Now it is time for all of those parties opposing this to either get on board or get out of the way, because Australians need housing now and they voted for a government to deliver.
The member for Petrie is warned. Order. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The House will come to order so I can hear from the member for Griffith.
Question to the Prime Minister. Millions of renters are in crisis and many are one rent increase away from eviction. The Greens have asked you for months to make an immediate investment from the budget in public housing and work with the states and territories to impose national limits on rent increases. And until this weekend you have refused. Prime Minister, now that you have caved in and put $2 billion on the table to get the Labor premiers to shift on housing, will you now show the same leadership and work with National Cabinet to make unlimited rent increases illegal?
Order. The Leader of the Greens will resume his seat. I'll take action on this. Order. I could not hear a word the member for Griffith was saying. His question will be heard in silence, like everyone else's. If anyone, whoever's laughing, if that's the Minister for Resources, she can cease interjecting as well, or be warned. So I want to be clear. The rules apply equally to everyone in this House. The member for Griffith will ask his question in silence. If anyone interjects, they'll leave the chamber immediately. Give the call to the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And if only they showed as much passion for renters.
Order.
Millions of renters
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. The member for Griffith was shown the respect of the House. He will show the respect to the House as well. He will ask his question and begin it now.
Question to the Prime Minister. Millions of renters are in crisis and many are one rent increase away from eviction. The Greens have asked you for months to make an immediate investment from the budget in public housing and work with the states and territories to impose national limits on rent increases, and until this weekend you have refused. Prime Minister, now that you have caved in and put $2 billion on the table to get the Labor premiers to shift on housing, will you now show leadership and work with National Cabinet to make unlimited rent increases illegal?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question. And it's a pity that the Greens political party have chosen to make themselves irrelevant to the debate. Because by refusing to participate, just like the coalition do, on these issues, they can take no responsibility for anything that this government does. Because we will not be held back by a coalition of the Liberal Party and the Greens political party saying no to public housing. And what we have done is work with states and territories on the issue of housing supply. Because yes, I understand that renters are doing it tough. Yes, I want to do things about that. Yes, that's why we have a renters' rights agreement we're working with states and territories through. But what we are not doing is destroying supply while we do it. Because the key to fixing housing is supply. And if we did what those opposite want us to do, there would be less supply of housing going forward. And that is what they don't seem to comprehend. The fact is that those opposite have prioritised protesting, they've prioritised building up a profile, they've prioritised politics rather than prioritising building public housing, which is why they voted against in the Senate to block the bill by deferring it. And I say this, at least those opposite in the Liberal Party don't pretend. They would have the guts to vote against public housing. I say to the Greens, in deferring this legislation yet again, they should have had the guts, as I said to the Leader of the Greens this morning, at least have the guts to vote against it. To say that you're against 30,000 additional social housing units, including housing for women and children escaping domestic violence, including housing for veterans, including housing for those in Indigenous communities. There are a range of things open to the government to do on policy-wise that we don't need a Senate which has decided to block everything. We'll take up those options. We certainly did on Saturday in announcing $2 billion of public going forward. In return for that, of course, the states and territories have agreed on planning reform. They want new zoning. And I say this, the challenge is, I bet you those opposite oppose every new zoning because they've never seen a medium density development they supported. In my area, the Inner West Council, they voted against every affordable housing development that has occurred. So don't come in here and say you care about public housing. Just vote.
Just remind the Prime Minister and all members the term no-alition is unparliamentary. Order. There's a lot of no-alitions going on. Order. Give the call to the member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. What work is the Albanese Labor government undertaking to improve access to housing for veterans, and what is standing in the way?
Give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Spence for his question, because it was a pleasure to join him in launching the next stage of delivering on a Veterans and Families Hub in his electorate to service the northern suburbs of Adelaide. And the member for Spence has been engaging with his veterans community. He did consultations, and as part of those consultations, he discovered that veterans would like to see greater assistance in being able to access housing and homelessness supports. Now, South Australia is blessed to have the Andrew Russell Veteran Living Centre, so having a hub in the northern suburbs of Adelaide will facilitate better access to veterans' housing. But not everybody is so fortunate. In fact, every year, about 6,000 contemporary veterans are at risk of homelessness. In March, we learnt from the census data in 2021 that there were over 1,500 individuals that have served our nation that were homeless on census night. So veterans are 3 times more likely to experience homelessness than the broader population. So, and knowing that, that's why, in addition to what they've got already in South Australia, we committed at the last election to fund a Scott Palmer Centre in Darwin, in the member for Solomon's electorate, to support those veterans in the Northern Territory. But we know that it's important to do more. Indeed, we need to maximise the opportunity of the Housing Australia Future Fund, and that's exactly what we want to do as a government. But the member for Spence asked an important question, Mr Speaker, and that's what is standing in the way. Well, let me tell you what is standing in the way. In fact, I could even tell you who is standing in the way. It's the Leader of the Opposition.
Order.
It's the Leader of the
Order.
Greens political party. It's the Leader of the National Party. It's the member for Griffith. It is those members of the Nationals, Liberal Party and Greens in the Senate are personally standing in the way of allowing us to invest $10 billion in a Housing Australia Future Fund to enable us to spend $30 million on housing to support our homeless veterans and services to support veterans that are at risk of homelessness. The Leave No Veteran Behind report of last month said doing nothing is just not an option. In fact, the Liberal Veteran State Minister said in Tasmania, the Tasmanian government welcomes the commitment of the Australian government to housing our vulnerable veterans. RSL Australia, the time for action is now. I even know that Liberal Senator O'Sullivan in Western Australia met with the RAFA Association there, the RAAF Association, who want to also bring on housing supports for our veterans, Speaker. But they can't access any funding for that because the Liberals, the National Party and the Greens are politicising this issue. They are politicising a fund and standing in the way of supporting veterans that are homeless. This is on your heads.
The Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians, and I refer to her previous responses. Minister, what areas of public policy will not be within the scope of the Voice?
The Minister for Indigenous Australians has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The question, I think, is repetitious. However, let me read out something that I think is very much worth reading to this parliament. And I say
Order.
to everyone that people are of goodwill and of generosity are going to be campaigning in the referendum. And this is something that was provided to me earlier today, and I'd like to read it into Hansard. Today is an historic day with the Constitution Alteration Bill passing the Parliament. Later this year, Australians will be able to vote at a referendum and complete our Constitution. A successful yes vote will recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians in the Constitution and create a voice to help close the gap. Despite being one of the most successful...
The Minister will continue.
Despite being one of the most successful nations in the world, on too many measures, our Indigenous brothers and sisters are not sharing the same outcomes as other Australians. The life expectancy of an Aboriginal Australian is 8 years below that of other Australians. The unemployment rate for Indigenous Australians is estimated to be about 9 times higher than fellow Australians. 1 in 5 Indigenous households are living in accommodation that does not meet an acceptable standard. The suicide rate for Indigenous Australians is almost 2.5 times of other Australians. Young Indigenous males are more likely to end up in jail than attending university. By writing yes, we can help change this. The Voice is a practical change that will help local, regional communities across Australia.
We'll pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the point of order is on relevance, and with the greatest respect to the Minister articulating the challenges this country faces in closing the gap. With greatest respect, Minister, the question was straightforward. Millions of Australians would like you to answer it. Can the Minister please answer the question? And, Mr Speaker, can you please bring the Minister to order?
Order. The Minister will continue and make sure her answer is relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I believe my answer is very relevant. By writing yes, we can help change this. The Voice is a practical change that will help local and regional communities across Australia. I will be supporting the yes case because it's a safe constitutional change and it will make a meaningful difference to the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Over the months ahead, I am looking forward to being part of a movement of Australians from all political backgrounds and playing a part in the campaign. Thank you to the member for Barara for providing me with your press release. It was very much appreciated.
The member for Parramatta has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. Last week, the Albanese Labor government fulfilled an election commitment that saw local governments across Australia come back to the table after 10 years. What foundations has this laid for the future of local government across the country?
Give the call. The member for Bowman. Give the call to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his question, a very important question, and I want to acknowledge the new Lord Mayor of Parramatta, Samir Padley, who I sat next to, the first Lord Mayor of subcontinent descent in our country. Last week, the Albanese government delivered on an important commitment for the local government sector by bringing back the Australian Council of Local Government to Canberra for the first time in a decade, an election commitment that we delivered on this government's promise to bring local government back to the table, an election commitment that brought together 650 local government representatives from every corner of Australia, from the Torres Strait to King Island, from Kununurra to Whyalla. Such is our commitment to listening to, learning from those who know their communities best, which is local government. There is a local government in every town, every village, every city across this country, and our solutions we need to listen to are locally led. Achieving net zero emissions was a significant theme across the forum, and local government was acknowledged as leaders in this space. And that's why we supported them with the announcement of a Community Energies Upgrade Fund, a $100 million Australian government investment which will co-fund energy-efficient projects across local communities, from pool heating upgrades to energy-efficient lighting for sporting ovals. I want to thank Minister Bowen and Assistant Minister McAllister for this announcement because they are listening to the sector. The forum also highlighted our refreshing approach to grant programs, new community infrastructure programs, growing regions and thriving suburbs. The forum discussed how transparent, merit-based, community-based programs need to be done.
Order. Members on my left.
It also, thank you, Mr Speaker. It's like Bay 13 interjecting, but Bay 13 at least are informative. Those opposite really didn't value the sector because they froze financial assistance grants, froze them, which has had a significant impact on every local council across the country, and we're still seeing that today. This side of the House, though, we have brought forward financial assistance grants to this year, and in the next couple of weeks they will receive their entire allocation of the 2023-24 financial assistance grants because we know how important it is to back the local government sector. We're listening to local communities through local councils. We are committed to building strong partnerships with our local governments to improve service delivery, to capitalise on our strengths and to help them tackle the big issues that are affecting their community. The clear message from local councils across the country was how refreshing it was that they now have a Prime Minister and a government
Members
that
on my
values
left.
their voice, that wants to work with them, that's committed to the sector and will be there for them
Minister's
day in,
time
day
has
out.
concluded. The call to the Prime Minister.
On that fine and positive note from the Minister for Local Government, I congratulate her on the convening of the Australian Council of Local Government last week, and I thank all of the mayors and shire presidents who I met with. There were 560 of them. If you wish me to really stay here for all of them, I'm up to it as long as someone gives me the list. So I thank them for their participation in the forum. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The